So, John, if our critics have failed us, then the finger's pointing at you. Have you failed us?
Well, I'm still gainfully employed, so I haven't failed entirely. I think that failure in criticism is got to be distinguished between a sort of institutional failure and personal failure. I think that the critic in some ways is only as good as the space that they're allowed. But on the other hand, I think it's up to the critic to actually make that space for themselves. I think if you just sit tight and you churn out something rather dull week after week, or you rather timidly accept that you're going to be able to write something which is small and, just like PR. I mean, a lot of criticism, or so-called art criticism nowadays, is really nothing more than a publicity release which has been in the microwave for a few seconds and then printed in the newspaper. A lot of PR people pride themselves on getting their entire press release reprinted in papers and under somebody else's name more often than not. So I'm in the peculiar position of doing the same job now that I was doing about 25 years ago. But it's my third stint doing exactly the same job, and each time I've done it, I've gone away, hopefully at the height of my powers, and come back and done it in a slightly different way. And once, the second time that I left the column it was about 3,000 words at that stage. So it was 3,000 words every week, which really was like a very large essay. And I passed it on, I think, to Bruce James, and within 6 months it had crumbled to half that size, and then eventually it was turfed out of the Saturday papers altogether. And it ended up as art criticism for the first time in living memory, really, in the Herald, became something which was put in midweek, like it is with the Age. And we had a lot of different people writing different bits and pieces, and it was awfully scrappy, and they got a lot of bad correspondence. They got a lot of people complaining about it, and eventually they restored it to Saturday and asked me to come back, and so basically I'm back exactly where I was after all these years doing the same thing.
Do you get 3,000 words now?
No, I get 1,500 words. And you've got to say, if you're used to writing 3,000 words a week, 1,500 words a week comes as a great relief and gives you the time to do something else. But in that 1,500 words, you can still say and do a lot. So it's really, you can't just sit there and say, oh, the newspapers are terrible, the print medium is dying, etc. Critics have to take responsibility for these things themselves and not expect that they're just going to be pawns of their venue.
Yes, but it's interesting.
Sorry, Patrick, I haven't even introduced you yet. You have to...
I want it to be a conversation.
No, it is, but I want to introduce everybody in turn first, so that you'll have to wait just a little bit longer, and then you can leap in, all right? Okay, so I'm going to come to Naomi Cass next. Naomi Cass, how do you rate the state of criticism in visual arts?
I think that question has really churned us up. I think that, judging by the attendance for this week, the issue of critical failure is very present for people, and an issue of great importance and churning. And I guess that's because criticism is about judgment, and maybe if we think about the sort of landscape or the ecology of what is the visual arts, that we might have a niggling fear that maybe there is a critical failure of the whole practice, of the whole range from individual artists right up to institution, because if criticism is an important part of this platform and it is failing, that maybe we all are failing in some way. So I'm trying to think of why this is churned. I mean, every time I open a newspaper this week or turn on the radio, this issue is being discussed. It could be because the Wheeler Centre has media partners.
They do the good PR and the advertorial that John McDonald was talking about.
Yes.
But it could be, as you say, and you seem to think it struck a chord.
Yeah, I think it does strike a chord. Now, but I haven't answered your question. So, do I think there is a critical failure? And I must say that during the conversations and discussions about Bill Henson, I thought there really is a critical failure, because in all the conversation, no one actually discussed the images. No one actually discussed his work, what it might mean. There was plenty of discussion about... I wasn't reading the Sydney paper.
So John McDonald obviously accepted it. You're suggesting, John, you did...
I did.
Yeah.
I didn't encounter a lot of discussion about, and I attended seminars and was being discussed in many places, and there was a reticence to, of course, within the art world, to criticise Bill. The issue was the legal issues were well dealt with, and there was no problem there. However, I think that there was a lot to be said about particularly the image on the invitation, and it wasn't discussed. People were not looking and interpreting. I was waiting for all the voices. There are plenty of good writers in the audience here. I was waiting to hear a discussion of what does it mean for this young woman to be looking down and the light behind and the light on her little hairs on her arms, and the fact that she can't see the photographer, she can't see the audience, we can see her, the photographer can see her. All those issues about what that means.
So if perhaps not critical failure, you would be suggesting we could do much better, I guess. There could be a better quality of critical debate, it seems to me what you're saying.
There could be a lot more space for critical debate. I think it's very important. I also think it's important we must distinguish, and I will be guilty of not distinguishing probably, between reviews and criticism.
Yeah, yep. Well, we might come to that a bit further on. Phip Murray, what's your take on contemporary criticism in the visual arts?
Well, I think I'm going to sound, for the first part, optimistic, and for the second part, probably disillusioned. In terms of optimism, from the position I come from, I think there's some really incredible arts writers, and I think they're writing some really wonderful commentary. I think they're hugely knowledgeable and hugely passionate, and I think there is a real culture, there's a really robust culture of critically engaged art and art writing. So I see it all around me. So I do feel like there is, in that sense, I don't see a critical failure. However, this is the disillusionment part, I guess. I think if you confine your reading to the daily papers or to mainstream media, then you are really confining yourself to a really narrow band of criticism. And I know it's a really persistent theme over these last few nights has been the difficulties of writing in that context. So I think there's good writers writing in that context, but it's a tough context. My frustration with a lot of the mainstream media outlets is that arts sort of gets lumped into the lifestyle category. It turns into kind of what's on advertorial capsule reviews, and my feeling, it's not, my feeling is that a lot of it is connected to advertising dollars as well. So you start losing this sense of diversity. And I work very much in the sort of, Un is an independent publication. Westspace is an artist-run independent organisation, so I'm not sort of as institutionally focused perhaps as some of the other panellists here, but I see really amazing coverage, really amazing ideas that are about Australian culture now. My frustration is that they're not really being widely shared, or that writers are not being given a really great opportunity to share those really interesting ideas.
Okay, Phip Murray, thank you. Patrick McCaughey, coming back to Australia from the United States?
Well, I think there's two observations I want to make about the critical scene at present in Australia. One is I had a very interesting reaction from a very well-established mid-career artist who'd had a very successful show in Melbourne and showing really very good, rather tough work. And the show had gone very well. And I said to them, congratulations on your show, and it's gone very well, and so on. And he said to me, well, a review would have been nice too. That this show had simply gone unnoticed, unreviewed, unreflected, and somehow unacknowledged as such. And that is a sense of critical failure, I think, there. The second thing is I just take slight odds with John about the decline of print media, which I think has affected art criticism in Australia. When I was the art critic of The Age, the greatest title any man can ever have, there were 4 practicing newspaper art critics in Melbourne. There was Alan McCulloch at the Herald, there was Alan Warren at the Sun, and there was Robert Rooney at the Australian. So that pretty regularly there were 4 critics writing. Now there's only 1. Now, in the bad old days, if you like, with these 4 critics, you did at least have some sense of 4 divergent critical points of view. Although whether Alan Warren ever actually had a critical point of view might have been debated. But there were, let's say, 3.5. And at least there was a sense of people were acknowledged. And it's the crucial thing in the making of art is that the work of art is acknowledged publicly somehow.
I certainly get that sense from artists who despair at the fact that they put a huge amount of work into a show and then it doesn't get acknowledged, at least not in the mainstream press. But John McDonald, what about the decline of the print media? I mean, this has been a theme throughout our discussions over this critical failure series, and it does seem we're in a transition between an established media, if you like, with established critics, names like yourself, and a much more democratic, if you like, much more free-for-all, online, journalistic, critical discussion.
Well, I mean, on one hand, I think Patrick's argument on one level is almost it's hard to get past when he says that there were 4 critics in those days, and then of course nowadays there is much more art. There are many more galleries, there are many more exhibitions worthy of review, but of course there are fewer reviews. So this, on one hand, is straightforwardly a pretty dire situation. But it didn't just happen like that overnight. When I remember sort of 15 years ago, the Sydney Morning Herald would run these huge reviews on Saturdays. There'd be a proper Friday column with maybe 3 or 4 commercial exhibitions being covered, and then there would be a sort of interview with an artist midweek, or a column on craft or photography, which gave yet more coverage, and then there would be a proper Metro listing, which was actually like a series of tiny little gallery vignettes. Now, all of that disappeared as newspapers began to make more money and they began to think more of their bottom line and their profits. And so they decided, why should we be giving this stuff away when we can charge for it? And so they began to charge for everything. The Metro section, which was a kind of a gallery guide, which was once a very comprehensive gallery guide, became a tiny little listing that people had paid to be in there, and it effectively ruined the whole idea of it as a guide. Now, what we have now is this environment where information is at our fingertips, it's all online. If you really want to know what's going on, you know, what exhibitions are there, you can log on, you can find any number of sites that will tell you what exhibitions are happening, you will find little comments, reviews, etc. I think there is, though, a world of difference of what we're getting online at the moment in terms of the quality of engagement and what you might actually find in a more considered criticism. I mean, I find that I will tune into blogs from time to time to see what's there, and I'm invariably disappointed, partly because of the way they're written. Like, if you read, I think, a genuinely considered piece of writing such that is going to go into print once and for all with your name on it, so you have to bear the brunt of whatever you say, and oppose that to something you might find on a blog. You might have some anonymous thing written by somebody who talks about themselves for about 600 words and then mentions the show and says something really flip or really nasty or sort of stupidly sycophantic about it. And I think criticism, above all, has to be the beginning of a conversation with your reader. It has to be the beginning of an intelligent conversation. Perhaps it has to be the beginning of an argument. It can't be prescriptive. It can't lay down the law and say this is a good show and this is a bad show. There is an element of theatre in it. And so you don't want to go in there and go and and my opinion's only as good as your opinion. You want to go in there and sound reasonably authoritative with what you say, because that's your job, that's your role. But you cannot say definitively true or false, good or bad. It's an opinion, and it's something which is there as a gambit for people to respond to as they feel fit. Now, my issue with a lot of the stuff that goes on online is that it is a mumbled, murmured, stoned conversation that doesn't actually go anywhere or have any strong points of view, often conducted by faceless people. And that is what I'd like to see sort itself out in the online environment before we have a genuinely vigorous, critical world out there.
But Phip Murray, I mean, if, as John McDonald says, and I agree with this, if criticism is about an argument, about putting forward an argument that invites further argument, the online space is a much better place for that than a newspaper.
I mean, it operates in a really different way, and I'd have to say, I mean, bad writing can happen in any forum. I think it was, Mark Twain said this lovely thing that it's a rare achievement to put the right word in the right place, anywhere you do it. So I think, the online field works very, very differently. You have to sort of navigate it in a different way. And I think if you know where to look, you can find really incredible, sustained, complex, thought-provoking writing. And there's certain sites that I go to repeatedly, and that's the kind of writing that satisfies me, whereas so much of what I read in, mainstream media, it's just kind of capsule review after capsule review. It's kind of, like some crazy 24-hour media spin cycle that we're all caught in. And the other thing that really excites me too is the growth of sort of independent presses too. So you start getting these smaller publishing houses, or people who are creating their own critical forums. And I think just because something's online doesn't mean that it does it sidesteps the process of making sure that something is print ready, or that it's been sort of fact checked, that it's a well put together argument. There's a lot of bad writing online.
There's a lot of rubbish. Yeah.
Sure.
Naomi Cass.
Do you think it might be useful to tease out the difference between criticism, reviews, because both criticism and review can appear online, but there's also the idea of the blog, which is slightly different. You can have a capsule review in a newspaper or online, and I think that they're very different things.
And of course there's much more of it online. When you think that if you go onto the blogs, you see the publicity release reprinted over and over and over again on 12 different websites.
One of the peculiar things about the online as to the print medium is that, of course the blogs and the stuff is in the public domain, but it doesn't seem to me to be in quite as openly in the public domain as criticism that, say, John McDonald writes in the Sydney Morning Herald, where you really he's appearing alongside other journalists. A certain standard and ethical standard and intellectual standard is demanded of him, whereas that's just not the case on the blog. You don't have that sort of control of the institution. Somehow it's less public. But I wouldn't agree with John completely. I mean, the task of criticism is to make judgments, good and bad. And if you're not making a judgment, you're not really looking. And the essence of criticism is the act of judgment. You may be right, you may be wrong, but it is absolutely essential that the critic makes the judgment up or down.
No, I wouldn't argue with the idea that the critic must make a judgment. What I would argue eventually is the transcendental nature of that judgment, that the critic's judgment has always got to be made. If you haven't got an opinion or a point of view, you haven't got a piece of criticism, because everybody is basically looking for a value judgment. They don't want to read something where you've gone, I like this, I don't like it, it's okay. They want to read something that forcefully says good or bad and why. But
it's got to be based on some knowledge. It's got to be based on...
And you have a licence to do it. I mean, but on the other hand, recognising you have a licence to do it and to say good or bad doesn't mean that those things are transcendentally good or bad. It just means that ultimately that's what you've said, and I always like to think that people can respond to it in their own way, can argue with it, and there's always a lot of people out there, as you know, Patrick, who will read you just for the pleasure of disagreeing, or going to shows for
Isn't the point of online writing that there isn't a shared set of beliefs about what's best or better, that online is a place of conversation rather than such fulsome declaration about...
So is it criticism then? Is it criticism then, or is it just discussion?
It's often discussion between communities, and it's much more fragmented, and it is responsive. So it is different in that sense from being in the public domain. There isn't a public domain. There are many domains.
That's true. But if we come back to the idea of that Patrick McCaughey raised about being documented, being seen to have been reviewed and acknowledged in a review, part of that, I wonder if part of that is also that ultimately the artist, I mean, unlike it with film or books or theatre that we've been discussing earlier in the week, there's a very direct relationship between the critic and the consumer. They can get the wallet out and buy the book or buy a ticket to the show. With most visual arts, it's free to look. But ultimately for many artists, not all artists, but for many artists, they want a sale. And without the authority of a voice like yours, John McDonald, they're not likely they may not get it. I mean, you have incredible power, don't you?
Well, I don't know. I think if you start getting hung up on your incredible power, you may as well just, go and take a shower or something. But
do you think you have a lot of power?
Well, I think that the column is influential in as much as it will attract a bigger audience. And this has been happening apparently more and more. The feedback I'm getting now from galleries is that a review on Saturday means that they have an enormous attendance that day, bigger than they've had before. So there's a lot of people reading, a lot of people responding. But it doesn't mean that they will sell more works. I mean, what you actually do is you have a kind of, whether you like it or don't like it, it doesn't seem to affect attendances. If you say it's a bad show, you still get a large attendance. People will come for a look, but they won't necessarily buy. I think when it comes down to it, it's not something that really forces and prompts people to put their hand in their pocket and to come out and say, I'm going to buy this work because John McDonald said it's wonderful. If they don't like it, they won't buy it. It's as simple as that. So the commercial imperative is very different to a lot of other things. If you're reviewing the theatre and you say this show stinks, not only can you close down the show, you can close down a company sometimes. So there's a rather awesome responsibility that theatre critics have that perhaps makes them, hold their fire sometimes, or if they don't, to be soundly loathed, as I know that often they are. Whereas visual arts, it's a little bit more of a game. It's a chess game in some ways. People like to believe that critics are villains, or they like to say, oh, I love everything you write, which is probably just as bad as thinking you're a villain. And the truth of it is that you try and get around and see as much as you can. You're limited in what you can write about. There's a lot of diplomacy that goes into it too. You don't simply get in there and say, oh, I'm going to be attacking this, or I'm going to be negative to that, or going wildly in favour of something. Often, most shows are sort of somewhere good shows with a few drawbacks, or bad shows with a few redeeming features. And so your column, your writing, is somewhere in between. I always think that the idea of writing something nuanced is the most important thing, but it doesn't mean you write it in a way which is not an argument. It actually has to be something there that picks up the reader in the first paragraph and pulls them through that article to the end. If you do it in little chunks and little bites and make it like an information centre, nobody could care less. If you're bored and it's boring for you to write, it's boring for people to read. So I always think that one of the imperatives of writing criticism is you have to write it entertainingly. It has to be well written. And if you're not doing that, you're not just not writing criticism, you're not writing anything worth publication.
Patrick McCaughey, as a director or former director of public institutions and private institutions, do you take notice of what critics say when you're acquiring works?
Well, not when one's acquiring works, but I mean, one does write admiring letters after favourable reviews to my erstwhile critical colleagues, and to encourage them to know that they're in the land of the blessed and they're loved, which is very important. But I think it's one of the differences, I think, between, to take Naomi's point about reviewing and criticism, reviewing is the first response. And it seems to me an absolutely critical part of the artistic experience, that it is what Kenneth Tynan once said years and years ago, that the job of the theatre critic was to tell his readers exactly what it was like to sit in the theatre on that night. And in a way, the reviewer, his or her job is to say what it's like to walk into this gallery and see these works.
It's beating a pathway.
Yeah, I mean, without sort of saying what they were like. I mean, the most tedious form of reviewing is always says, well, these works come on 4 years ago, Bloggs was doing so-and-so, and they were better than what's being done now, and so on, which is pointless, because nobody can see what was done for 4 years ago. But that active sense about actually saying what the experience is like in the gallery is, I think, the reviewer's great task. And that's a bit different, I think, from a more reasoned critical view in which one does want to make judgments. And I would say what John said, but I would want to add that the really great critics are those who are able to show the basis of their taste. Not just to have an opinion, but to actually show how they arrive at that particular judgment. And I always think, not to kick a man when he's down, but I mean, Bob Hughes is a very interesting reviewer. But he's only interesting when he's on the attack. When Bob is praising something, he sounds like a kindergarten art appreciation officer.
It's Phip and I are working in contemporary art spaces, and I'm not watching out for how many reviews you get, but I can tell you we get very few. and we probably get even less long-form criticism. It might be where we sit in the sector, and the artists who exhibit at CCP then go on. But it's a deafening silence for people when there is such little response to their work.
And also when there is such an extraordinary diversity of work out there and people working in the arts, people making art, looking at art. I mean, it is an extraordinarily vibrant field, and yet it doesn't seem to attract interest.
I think there have been little developments and changes, and I think Phip's more familiar with the online world than I am. But if I think of things like a small magazine like Art Fan, or then the blog Speech, that was artists who had sort of given up, lost heart about ever being engaged with, about anyone coming in and really looking at their work and talking about it. And that was a sense of partly a tribe of people who were looking, but partly bringing in experts from other fields. So in a sense, it's a response to a critical failure that artists need to bring in, you know, someone from the chemist shop down there or a scientist from over here to come in and comment, because just to open up a sense of conversation.
To start doing it for themselves, as it were, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's the whole reason Unmagazine was started, and it was a number of years ago, and it was the deafening silence, and just this sense that there were these. Melbourne in particular is very well known for its independent arts. Collectives and practices, but it was really getting no coverage at all. So it was really a whole lot of artists and writers that got together that started to self-publish, and it had a whole bunch of different names. One of them was to give some acknowledgement and critical coverage of this incredible art content that was being made around us. So it was about documenting and commenting on this this particular field of art. But it was also importantly about developing writers too. So actually giving writers that haven't been published so much or don't have a regular opportunity to publish a chance to hone their kind of critical writing skills, and just as importantly developing a readership for that as well. So really trying to create a forum and a space where all these different ideas could be examined.
But I wondered to what end, having, trained or developed people. There's the marvellous Next Wave runs a writing program, Gertrude Contemporary runs a writing program, and I don't know where all the writers are going to go, because there isn't the space for that long form, that beautiful long.
But there are quite a lot of magazines in Australia. I mean, there's Art in Australia, there's ArtLink, it's quite a range of quarterly or monthly magazines that look at the contemporary art scene.
They're reviews. I'm not sure there's a huge amount of criticism.
Well, that's true, but comparatively speaking, per capita, Australia must have more art magazines and, funded and supported art magazines than any country in the world. We have a huge number of magazines, but those magazines are small circulation, small readership, and often we find that the articles in there are read in very small circles, or indeed the articles are often people writing about their friends and stuff like that. That's where it ends up becoming really quite boring to read, because you don't have to read between the lines very far to understand that the writer is writing about somebody they know quite well, and so it's like a favour or a promotional exercise. And that is where criticism becomes debased, because you realise you're not actually reading anything but another ad.
Well, I see this in Melbourne. I see people writing about friends and colleagues. Is it a problem?
If Apollinaire was not to write about people he knew about, who was he going to be writing about? You do get communities of people coming through the university, and then there are their friends at the VCA.
You're absolutely right about Apollinaire. Apollinaire was the greatest nepotist and lurk of all time. He just happened to be writing about rather interesting artists who are his friends. but it's true, if you read Apollinaire, it's gushing awful rubbish most of the time. Occasionally he hits the mark, but we shouldn't put Apollinaire on a pedestal just because he wrote about Picasso, Modigliani, and all of these artists who went on to become the great artists of the modern era. He still wrote in a really quite ghastly way about them.
Phip Murray, is this a problem for the sort of thing you're talking about? Community of artists coming together to create something because they're not getting written about elsewhere, and then you have a conflict of interest, essentially.
Look, I think there's communities of artists around everyone. I think they're around John. I think they're around Patrick. I think they're around the NGV. I'm not sure why we're singling out the kind of independence art spheres. I don't think that there's a lack of critical distance. I think there's, I think people are really carefully and professionally writing about art practices. So I don't think it's, just mates writing about each other. And I don't know if you've ever actually read Un magazine, but it...
Never read Un magazine. I plead guilty.
What about Flash?
I've never read Flash either. I feel so left out now. I haven't read any of these magazines.
I think it's possible.
But you didn't read the Sydney Morning Herald either.
And I could have read it online.
Exactly.
I think it's possible that we've all got a different idea, maybe, of what criticism, long-form criticism is, that in another time there might have been a shared sense of values, a shared sense of a canon, and that makes, I think for a lot of young people that's finished, that there isn't those shared values, but it is about a dialogue and a conversation, and they're not going to be offering judgment. I'm not sure if you...
honestly, every art critic worth his or her salt will always know the artists whom he or she is writing about. It's an inevitable part. You're part of that of the art scene, and one makes friends and enemies daily when one's an art critic. But I think on the whole, what really defines good critics, I think, is that they keep the eye on the object. It's that which is the scrutiny.
The ball, not the man, Patrick.
Pardon?
Play the ball, not the man.
Play the ball. I'm shamelessly. it sounds so self-righteous now. Shamelessly. I was appalling to people when I was the art critic of the Age, and I'm ashamed. And if the relatives are in this room, the survivors, I beg down and beg your mercy and an apology speech to you. But there's no question that you do, and that's. I think you're always going to be engaged with that. And artists expect you to be engaged with the scene at this moment. You can't step out of it somehow.
Everybody knows artists. You'd be a very strange critic if you didn't know artists, like you'd be a very strange critic if you didn't have a picture on your wall or something like that. But, in this kind of ideal, objective laboratory of art, you wouldn't know artists, you'd keep your distance, you wouldn't have any works of art in your personal possession. But I think the difference is, obviously we all know artists and we're friendly with artists or not, and obviously we all own works of art, but we just mustn't make that the determining factor about what one writes about. You have to try very, very hard to keep a level of distance and objectivity involved. We know that a perfect objectivity is not possible, but we have to aim towards that. And I've reviewed shows by artists that I was personally friendly with and been quite critical of them, and then, there's been sort of like 6 months of rather frozen standoff, and then perhaps, we become friends again. But you feel like you can't shirk a judgment if the judgment is there to be made. You can avoid it by not writing about that show, but on the other hand, if you find you have to do it and it's going to go on the record in print, you've got to come clean. I know there, certain critics I think that they can write any old thing in the newspaper, but if they're writing, in a book or an academic journal, that's all very serious. But I think it's the opposite. I think if it's in the newspaper, it's really on the record for all time, and so you have to be straight.
Are there things a visual arts critic should never do?
Well, there's lots of things you should never do. I took the precaution tonight of writing down 3 things which I once found in an issue of the Sydney Morning Herald during those dark days when the art column had been banished to some nasty, sort of vague thing on Wednesday, and a whole bunch of people were writing. So there were 3 separate reviews on 2 pages of the newspaper, and I took one line from each of the 3 reviews written by 3 different people. And I think there are wonderful lessons here as to what not to do. The first one: many have been the collectors deflowered, as it were, by Norman Lindsay's prodigious etching tool. Now, I think this was trying to act the critic with this. I'd say it was trying to be an example of wit or colourful, vivid prose, but it turns out into something rather like a cross between Noel Coward and Derek and Clive. The second quote: "The project is very worthy and viewing very enjoyable, but it is so wide-reaching that assessment is difficult." Which I take to be a penetrating insight into the show, not to mention the role of the critic. And the third one is: "The catalogue is a delight, and I will buy several copies as Christmas presents for friends," which is a new hybrid of art review and Christmas gift guide. Now, all of these things just seem to me like a waste of space. You're showing off, you're trying various things, but none of it is criticism. It's all shirking the issue of actually getting to grips with the thing in front of you, either because they were too timid or too frightened, or they felt like they wanted to show off their great prose style in some way. But this is just 3 sentences taken almost at random from 3 reviews, and each one to me is an example of what not to do.
I think there's a problem that we haven't thought about, maybe, in Australia, criticism as being an important, serious job, a paid role within a whole sort of ecology of what's going on in the arts, and that it is self-reflexive in a way, that the criticism follows and then it leads and follows, that there is a relationship with artists. If you really want to know what's going on in the arts, you ask an artist. If you really want somebody who's read widely, you ask an artist. So it's insulting not to respond to an artist's work with a pretty serious, layered, long look.
Surely that's what artists want. They want a critic who's going to engage with what they've tried to do. They're going to engage with the work.
So they say. I mean, a lot of artists basically want a critic to praise them, and there are other critics other artists who are very happy just to be looked at. They feel like even to be looked at is sort of proof of their existence and the validity of what they're doing. And so they say, "I just want you to see my show. I don't care if you write nothing." You know, and fair enough. It's 3 or 4 years' work. It's one show. It's up for 3 weeks. Obviously, you want the critic. You want everybody to see it. But there is a lot of, there's no one rule for these things.
I think that makes an interesting point, though. I mean, I'm always struck when I come back to Melbourne is just how much good art is being made. And then also struck by how many artists somehow manage to live off their art. I mean, God knows. And I mean, very few people really sell equally well outside of their native city. Very few sell. I mean, Jeffrey Smart apart, who sell equally well in Sydney and Melbourne and so on. And so I'm always impressed by the tenacity of Australian artists, that they somehow survive. And one of the things I think is very interesting is the point that you can be an art critic. You don't have to have a job in a newspaper. There are lots of places you can write art criticism for in Australia. The magazines you've been mentioning, there are quarterlies, and if you begin to write, then you will be picked up. I can't believe The Age would persevere with its present critic if they could find another good critic to put in its place, and you could establish that by writing yourself independently. And it's the one curious kind of failure in the Australian scene, which I rather agree with you about. People, I mean, all these graduates pouring out of the finance department of the University of Melbourne, all doing courses in curating. And,
there's no curatorial positions either, let me tell you.
Not paid ones, anyway. There's lots of room for volunteerism in the arts, obviously, in visual arts. I mean, Patrick, you talk about the number of people who live from their art, but in my experience, they live from their art and they teach, or they earn money in some other way.
That's to be reiterated, that in order for an artist to... They're not going to be making, many people are not going to be making much or of a living at all. So the sort of layering of people writing about your work, prizes, these are the way that an artist can build their capital, because it's not a financial capital. So the criticism is very important, and within the whole sense of developing someone's career.
Yeah, I mean, I often go and see terrific exhibitions sometimes in the regional galleries which have got no hope of getting reviewed, and the sort of spaces which you and Phip run,
We never
I
get
mean, a lack of energy, critical energy, I think, is apparent.
The problem with someone employed in a university and writing reviews is that they're not independent. They can't be. They're working in an art school and they've got responsibilities to their art school, and I think it does affect. I think it's important to have independent people writing criticism.